Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. The Deputy Premier knows better, but okay, fair enough. One mulligan today. I've got a table of documents. So pursuant to Section 39 of the Advocate for Children and Youth Act, I'm submitting one copy of the annual 2018 report to be tabled in the Legislative Assembly today. Introduction of guests. Recognize the Minister of Advanced Education.
Well, here. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, up in the West Gallery, we have 23 grade 8 students from McCall Massey School. Can you give a wave? And they are accompanied by someone who's no stranger to many of us here in the Assembly, Devin Peters, their teacher, who hails to us from the University of Regina as an alumni. So I'd ask all members to join me in welcoming them to their Legislative Assembly. I got one more. And while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, also in the West Gallery, I would like to introduce you to the Engineering Student Society of the University of Regina. Today we have Maxim Zubutny, Taylor Patrician, Paul Hewitt, and Ian Quach. Mr. Speaker, this team of software systems engineering students just recently traveled to compete at the Canadian Engineering Competition in Waterloo. Artificial intelligence is one of the major disruptors of the digital age, and in the programming competition, their challenge was to use artificial intelligence to create and communicate with a robot that is capable of cleaning a restaurant, sort garbage, recyclables and organics into separate bins. If you had one to come do my housework, I'd be really thrilled too. They placed third in this competition, Mr. Speaker, against some of the biggest universities in Saskatchewan, and students just like this team will go on to contribute in Saskatchewan's tech sector and help us grow this space. I'm really pleased that they're here today. I'm looking forward to hearing all about the competition in Waterloo, and I'd ask all members to join me in welcoming them to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Minister in welcoming the members of the Engineering Students Society here to their Legislative Assembly, and to congratulate them on their third place win in Waterloo. That is quite an accomplishment and something that we are all here in this Assembly very, very proud of. So thank you, and I invite all members to join me in welcoming them and congratulating them on their third place finish.
Recognize a member for Regina Pasqua.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais présenter cette classe d'Ovensis étudiants brillants d'école Massey. Mr. Speaker, that Massey School class, having my son in there in grade 8, is a very obedient kid and very punctual in squash and badminton. I do not know that how punctual he is in the class. Teacher must know that, Mr. Speaker. He's a very good golfer as well. Very excited to go in high school next year. You ask all the members to join me to welcome this class in their Legislative Assembly. Thanks.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will not attempt any French, but I do want to welcome McCall Massey School as well. And in particular, I'd like to welcome Mr. Devin Peters. Many folks here know him under a number of different roles, but I met Devin when he was a cadet, and he worked in my cadet corps as the Chief Warrant Officer. So I spent a lot of time with him when he was in his maybe more awkward teenage years, and can say that he's been a leader since the beginning, Mr. Speaker, and those leadership skills have continued in every aspect of life that he has went through, and I would like to ask all members to join me in welcoming him to his assembly.
Recognize the member for Wall Shakers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I'd like to welcome 26 Ecole St. Mary students from the constituency of Regina Wall Shakers They're accompanied by their teachers, Catherine Williams and Lori Cooper, and parent chaperones, Jeff Henfrey, Selena Stillborn, and Darlene Connell. I look forward to having a conversation with them after the proceedings here today, Mr. Speaker. So I ask all colleagues to welcome them to their Legislative Assembly.
Hear, hear. Presenting petitions. Recognize the member for Moose Jaw North.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. We know that the federal imposed carbon tax will have adverse effects on the Saskatchewan economy. We know that the federal imposed carbon tax will do little to nothing in actually reducing greenhouse gases. We know that the Prayer Resilience Made in Saskatchewan climate change strategy is designed to curb greenhouse gas emissions, prepare for changing conditions, protect people and communities through resilience and readiness, and is an effective strategy to reduce emissions without damaging the economy. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed from citizens of Kildare, Moose Jaw, and Craig. I so present.
And as a member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again to present petitions on behalf of concerned citizens, local businesses and communities from all across Saskatchewan as it relates to the Sask Party government's choice to impose the PST onto construction labour, Mr. Speaker. Of course, this was a damaging decision. It's quite simply the epitome of a job-killing tax, Mr. Speaker. And we see the consequences of this, Mr. Speaker. We see permits that are down all across Saskatchewan. We see projects that have been shelved, Mr. Speaker. We see thousands of Saskatchewan tradespeople that have lost employment, Mr. Speaker, and that have been forced to move from Saskatchewan. And of course, the member from Cannington makes a lot of noise from his seat, Mr. Speaker, but this, in fact, the PST increase of this government accounts for $1 billion increase by this government, a doubling of the take of PST, all by that Sask Party government and the member from Cannington, Mr. Speaker. This has hurt our economy and needs to be fixed. The prayer reads as follows. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction and stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. These petitions here are signed by concerned residents from Regina. I so submit.
As a member for Saskatoon, Newtana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to present a petition calling for a public inquiry and forensic audit into the Regina bypass land scandal. The individuals who signed this petition would like to bring to our attention the following. Land developers purchased 640 acres of land along Tower Road and had the Regina bypass moved to accommodate their developments. Thousands of people were impacted directly and lost their land, homes, businesses, access, life's work, health, history, and future. Land developers are paid up to 80 times more for their land than long-term land, home, and business owners. The cost of the Regina bypass exploded from $400 million to now over $2 billion. And Vinci, a French contractor that is deeply rooted in scandals in Europe, was awarded the contract to build the $2 billion Regina bypass. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan call for a judicial public inquiry and forensic audit into the entire Regina bypass land scandal. Mr. Speaker, the individuals signing this petition today are from the communities of Wynyard, Foam Lake, Wishart, Regina, and Saskatoon. I so submit.
As a member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics, and the undersigned residents of the province of Saskatchewan want to bring to our attention the following: that Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, even those living outside the province, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties. Mr. Speaker, the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. But, Mr. Speaker, we know that over the past 10 years, the Saskatchewan Party has received $12.61 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.87 million came from companies outside Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, simply, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people. And, Mr. Speaker, the federal government and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, and Nova Scotia have moved to limit that influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to overhaul Saskatchewan campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition today come from the city of Saskatoon. I do so present. Thank you.
As a member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to stand in my place today to present the petition as it relates to the dialysis unit for northwestern Saskatchewan communities. Mr. Speaker, there are a growing number of individuals living with kidney failure, and there is a disproportionate burden amongst those that live in northwestern Saskatchewan communities. Mr. Speaker, the technicians that could run the equipment to provide this service could be trained, creating more work in the area, but primarily providing service to many of these people suffering from kidney challenges. Nurses from the locality could be trained to run the dialysis unit, and that access to health services is one of the key determinants, one of the 12 key determinants of health outcomes. A satellite dialysis unit in the area would help create optimal health outcomes while minimizing healthcare costs and the financial burden to patients. So the prayer reads as follows, Mr. Speaker: to cause the provincial government to provide the public funding needed to set up a satellite unit in northwestern Saskatchewan and provide hemodialysis treatment that is in closer proximity to patients' homes. This would greatly lessen the burden of out-of-pocket costs for the people from the area who are undergoing kidney dialysis. This would allow northwestern Saskatchewan people with kidney failure to live where they want to live and not have to be forced to move away in order to survive and stay alive. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've had many champions that have signed this petition from all throughout the province of Saskatchewan, and this huge volume of petitions that I'm holding in my particular hand today, Mr. Speaker, are all from the #1 community that championed this whole effort, and that is the fine community of La Loche and the Clearwater River Dene Nation. These are all their signatures, page after page after page, and I so present, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition on some proposed seed regulations. Mr. Speaker, the petitioners wish to draw to our attention that the federal government is proposing to pass regulations that would change the seed laws in our country, that would give international seed companies complete control over plant varieties registered after February of 2015. Mr. Speaker, these proposals are being promoted under the guise that they'll enable private research, but Mr. Speaker, the proposals do not give farmers any guarantee that any of the royalties will be devoted to funding research. They don't provide any guarantee that research would put the dollars, the research value, back into farmers' pockets, and nor do they give any guarantee that the research would even be on Canadian crop varieties. Mr. Speaker, the petitioners want to bring to our attention that the current model of both public and farmer-funded research has generated returns of up to 20-to-1 for the Canadian public and for farmers. In the prayer, Mr. Speaker, the petitioners respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to advocate on behalf of farmers with the federal government to ensure that the rights of farmers to freely use their own seed be established and maintained. that endpoint royalties and trailing royalties will not be imposed on farmers, and that any seed research that is paid by farmers will be controlled and directed by farmers. Mr. Speaker, the petitioners signing this petition are from the cities of Swift Current and Val Marie. I so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. I recognize the member for Kelvington-Wadena.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the 4th annual bull sale at Allenville Farms took place in Birkdale. However, this year the sale was a bit different. Mr. Speaker, Mark Van Hastert from Allenville Farms was diagnosed with MS last June. After his diagnosis, Mark started attending the MS clinic in Saskatoon, which has been crucial in helping him return to a normal life. This year, while organizing the sale catalog, he suggested that the sale put on a fundraiser for the clinic where he had been receiving treatments. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to report that Mark, along with his wife Erin, were able to raise $13,580 in 10 minutes. After the announcement of the final total, Mark's father then stepped up and matched the final count with another $14,000 donation. Mr. Speaker, Mark and Erin were inspired by such generosity as they added the other $2,420 to bring the final donation total to $30,000. All the proceeds will be going toward MS research right here in Saskatchewan through the Saskatoon City Hospital Foundation. Mark and Erin are grateful for the generosity of their community for supporting Mark through his journey to better health. Mark also has nothing but praise for Dr. Levin and the staff at the MS Clinic. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in congratulating Mark and Erin on their successful and life-changing fundraiser.
As a member for Athabasca.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in the Assembly today to share news about an outstanding achievement of 8-year-old Bree Sylvester from La Loche, who competed in the Saskatchewan Wrestling Freshie Bantam Provincials in March. Bree traveled from Regina from La Loche, and she and other competitors showed that wrestling is alive and well in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure to inform you that Bree took home the top prize for her age group. It is a beautiful thing to see talented young people from the North succeeding in events like provincials held here in Regina. But Bree's mom, Renelle, put it the best, and I quote, "Some days I feel overwhelmed with our busy lives, but being able to be present at the proud moments makes all the long drives and the early mornings totally worth it." End her quote. I couldn't agree more, Mr. Speaker, and I want to congratulate Renelle for raising a strong Northern leader like Bree. I would also like to congratulate Bree's cousin, Lexis Chaplin, who took the title of the most outstanding female wrestler of the tournament. I know that these young women will continue doing great things. To Bree, Lexis, their families, and their communities, keep up the great work because you make us all very proud. Mr. Speaker, I invite all the Assembly members to join me in congratulating Bree for her accomplishments and in wishing her success in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Recognize the member for Saskatchewan Rivers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The area of central North Saskatchewan boasts a rich biodiverse environment and boreal forests that flourish with a variety of wildlife and outdoor opportunities. Mr. Speaker, the wilderness region allows visitors to be immersed in rich heritage and cultural events, fantastic culinary adventures, while also experiencing the beauty of the outdoors all year round. Located in my constituency, the region consists of Prince Albert National Park, the District of Lakeland, Elk Ridge Resort, and the town of Big River. The Waskesiu Wilderness Region is a not-for-profit organization that was established in 2010. It encompasses the very important transition area between Aspen Parkland and the Boreal Forest. The organization is run by a board of directors and accompanying staff members. Mr. Speaker, the board members are local tourism operators who volunteer and invest their time to create marketing initiatives that promote visitation to the area. Their current promotion, Unforgettable North, encourages visitors to escape the city life and visit the North, where you can experience all there is to do in the natural setting of the beautiful Boreal Forest. I encourage all my colleagues to plan a trip to the region this summer, take in and explore the wonderful wilderness of the Waskasiu Wilderness Region. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
And as a member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, April 27th, I had the pleasure of attending the 2019 Prince Albert Sports Hall of Fame. This year's inductees were Brad Bibby, Blake Edwards, Don and Ethel Haluka, Blair Hoffman, Mark McElligott, Luke Robin, Paul Roy, Derek Smith, and the Prince Albert Gymnastics Club. Mr. Speaker, this year's inductees are deserving additions to the Prince Albert Sports Hall of Fame. They all work hard in our community to ensure that all sports are available to those who wish to take part. They are all mentors for our young athletes, and they are not afraid of the hard work that comes with promoting, coaching, and developing sports. The Prince Albert Hall of Fame is located on the second floor of the Art Hauser Centre. It was officially formed in 1989 as a satellite to the Provincial Hall of Fame. Since then, over 200 inductees has been added. I wish to commend the Prince Albert Hall of Fame board members for recognizing the importance of sports and for acknowledging people in our community who contribute so much to keep sports alive in Prince Albert. Thank you also for preserving our community's rich sports history. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all members join with me in congratulating the 2019 inductees into the Prince Albert Hall of Fame and to the Board of Directors for organizing this year's induction ceremony. Thank you.
Recognize a member for Cannington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Simone Magachu, an extraordinary woman from Redverse, Saskatchewan. Simone exemplifies active aging. She is a 101-year-old participant in the Forever in Motion program at the Redverse Centennial Haven, obviously built after she was born. Forever in Motion is a free physical activity program by the Saskatchewan Parks and Recreation Association and is geared for people as young as 55 and older. The program is led by trained volunteers and runs in seniors' housing facilities and community and leisure centres across Saskatchewan. Simone has participated in this program since it began in the community of Redverse back in September of 2018. She is enjoying the weight training component of the program and recently asked the instructor if she could increase the weights in the class from 1 pound to 2. Simone looks forward to this program because it is an opportunity to spend time with her children, Zoe and Albert, and stay active with the family. When asked what she likes about the program, Simone said, quote, "I like it when it helps keep me mobile, moving, and my heart going." Mr. Speaker, I would ask all members to join me in congratulating Simone, Zoe, and Albert for encouraging active aging and showing us that being physically active is important at any age.
Recognize the member for Melville Saltcoats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in the House today to highlight a great Saskatchewan business from my constituency, Century Glass Limited. It's a facility that has operated since 1979 in the city of Melville. Today, it is owned and managed by Brian and Raylene Prieb from Melville. Their company manufactures and installs top-quality windows for renovations and new construction around the area and throughout Western Canada. They're currently one of only 3 major residential window manufacturers in the province. It's interesting how the Prieb family got in the business, Mr. Speaker. They used to be farmers as well as custom harvesters right near where their glass facility is today. One fateful day, as they were harvesting beside the business, a small stone actually went through the combine and was shot right through one of the glass windows in the Century Glass building. This small incident introduced the Prieb family to the then owners of the window manufacturer, who were interested in moving on from the business. Thanks to this little stone, more conversations were had, and the Priebs took over operations. 1 year later, they were the new owners of the business and are enjoying their new business venture in Saskatchewan. They use the latest new laser technology in manufacturing processing, incorporating all the necessary environmental energy efficient products. They employ 16 local residents. Thanks to that little stone, the Prieb family got to enjoy the great Saskatchewan business advantage. Mr. Speaker, I now ask my colleagues to join me in congratulating Century Glass Limited on a successful business journey and all the best in the future.
Recognize a member for the Battlefords.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on April the 18th, on behalf of the Minister of Corrections and Policing, I had the pleasure of joining the RCMP, SARM, SUMA and the FSIN to announce the expansion of the Saskatchewan Crime Watch Advisory Network. This network was initially launched in March with the initial rollout in southern Saskatchewan. Due to the number of Saskatchewan residents who signed up to receive these alerts, the network was expanded earlier than anticipated. About 7,200 people from across the province have registered to receive these RCMP alerts. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan residents have clearly expressed an interest in getting up-to-date, credible and reliable information regarding crime occurring in their area. Saskatchewan residents are the eyes and ears of their communities, and getting this information to residents allows them to be better able to assist the police. We are proud to have worked with the RCMP and our other partners to help make the Crime Watch program available to everyone across Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, the Saskatchewan Crime Watch Advisory Network initiative responds directly to our government's goal to improve the response to rural crime. The Saskatchewan Crime Watch Advisory Network is one tool we can use to work together to help make our province safer for all of us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question period. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Saskatchewan farmers want to see action on the canola crisis. The the Agricultural Producers Association of Saskatchewan, APAS, is calling for Saskatchewan crop insurance to provide additional staff support and to see agri-stability coverage enhanced, 2019 enrollment fees removed, and the option for interim payments. These are reasonable requests, Mr. Speaker, things that can be offered today. Yesterday, the Agriculture Minister wouldn't commit to those or really any other actions, instead pointing fingers elsewhere, waiting for decisions elsewhere. Will this government step up and do more than point fingers elsewhere? Will they take responsibility and take the reasonable actions that Saskatchewan farmers are asking for to deal with the canola crisis?
Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government will always stand up for farmers and ranchers in this province of Saskatchewan. And trust me, Mr. Speaker, the farmers and ranchers trust this government to support them in every avenue of agriculture, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will be talking to the Federal Minister of Agriculture later today, Mr. Speaker. Hopefully we're going to see an announcement later this week. Mr. Speaker, we have put a proposal to the federal government. We put it back in March 26th. Towards the end of March, we put a proposal on for an interest-free cash advance of $1 million for farmers to be able to access, to at least give them some opportunity to put the crop in the ground and help alleviate some of that pressure. We've been in constant communication with the federal government, with the federal officials, through my office and through the ministry's office, Mr. Speaker. We've offered any support that we can to help resolve this problem of the canola issue to China, Mr. Speaker, and we're hopefully today, when I talk to the Federal Ag Minister later today, we will have an answer, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, advocating to the federal government is absolutely essential when trying to deal with this canola crisis, but it isn't enough. It isn't enough. This government has many levers they can use to improve the lives of Saskatchewan farmers. People are in a very stressful situation right now. This is a crisis. We need a message from this government that they're going to be willing to step up. Whatever the federal government does, that they will do their role. What steps will this government take with their own actions to help farmers make sure that our producers are taken care of in the midst of this canola crisis?
Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've said, the farmers and ranchers in the province of Saskatchewan trust this government. They have their faith on us. They count on us. Mr. Speaker, all you have to look at is look at the representation on this side of the House from rural Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. I don't see any rural representation from over on that side of the House, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Recognize the Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've always...
Member for Douglas Park, please come to order. I recognize the Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will always support the farmers and ranchers in this province, Mr. Speaker. As I said in my previous answer, Mr. Speaker, I will be talking to the federal minister later today, Mr. Speaker. I know my counterpart, the Minister of Trade and Export, is talking to his counterpart later today, and I know the Premier is talking to the Prime Minister later today also, Mr. Speaker. We put a proposal on the table. We're hoping that they're going to have an announcement for us here in the next few days. That's where it's at now, Mr. Speaker, and as I said, I'm hoping that the Federal Minister of Agriculture, when I talk to her later today, will have some answers for us on this problem, Mr. Speaker.
Recognized Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Failing to take responsibility and being willing to offer something for farmers from Saskatchewan, from the Saskatchewan government, is a good way to lose that support that they've previously enjoyed in rural Saskatchewan. You take that for granted, you'll lose that trust, Mr. Speaker, and we see that slipping away. And this is what this government likes to do. This Premier likes to point fingers elsewhere. They like to point at other levels of government, at other provinces, to distract from their own record of cuts to healthcare and education, of attacks on our Crown corporations, of the doubling of the PST, Mr. Speaker. You can see why they wouldn't want to talk about those things. But now what's the flavour of the day? Last week we heard the Premier float the idea of a referendum on equalization. And Mr. Speaker, we don't need to spend millions of dollars to know that we're not getting a fair deal on equalization, Mr. Speaker. That's something we all know and we all agree upon, Mr. Speaker. That's the deal New Democrats have been fighting for, whoever's in power in Ottawa. If the Premier really wants to see a better formula, if this government really wants to see a better formula, why not take a step with actual legal effect? Why not take this unfair formula in front of the courts?
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's interesting because it doesn't happen very often, but I think the one thing that we agree with the members opposite is the equalization formula is not fair for the people of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. In context, the Premier's comments was we wouldn't rule anything out. He didn't commit us to a referendum or any such thing. He just said we're not going to rule anything out. We put a proposal for Ottawa to consider the 50-50 proposal. Unfortunately, they did not accept that proposal. However, we'll continue on every front possible to bring forward some suggestions of what we can do, which is unlike the members opposite who never have a suggestion of an alternative other than go to courts, and they're assuming that those courts won't cost any money. Well, indeed they will, Mr. Speaker. They criticized what a referendum will cost. Well, what would a court case cost, Mr. Speaker?
Recognized Leader of the Opposition.
We have a suggestion. We have a very clear suggestion, and it's a suggestion that's been made for many years. Let's remove non-renewable resource revenues from that equalization. Let's have a better deal. That would have got us back in 2005, $800 million more a year. Imagine what we could have got with $800 million more for health care, for education, for investing in green jobs. And Mr. Speaker, if you take this to court, you get a real answer. If we take it in a referendum, there's no meaningful impact, no legal effect. We have this opportunity, we have this option in front of us that can actually work. This government across said they'd do that, and then they backed away. Why not make a decision now? Will this government today commit to taking this to court, no matter who's, hey, let's not wait till the federal election, let's do it now, so it's not dependent on whether or not you're a conservative in Ottawa or a liberal.
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, obviously the member opposite should know. He should know that a court case on this particular issue would be very, very difficult to win because of the way that equalization is structured. However, it is kind of humorous that they're now calling for us to take...
We'll keep doing it. I'll keep standing up and going and sitting down again, but I recognize the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's kind of humorous that they should be calling on us to go to court on this on the equalization issue, because what did they have to say when we went to court on the carbon tax, which we believe we have a very compelling case, a very winnable case. Quite frankly, they called it a pointless crusade, Mr. Speaker, which demonstrates that they support a carbon tax and they support Justin Trudeau on that particular front, and yet now they want to grandstand and pretend they don't support him on equalization. Mr. Speaker, really? Really? That is absolute hypocrisy.
Recognized Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we do not support Justin Trudeau's carbon tax. And if the minister chooses to repeat that, she's choosing to ignore the facts and her own words.
Recognize Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we've made that very clear. We do not support that. We do have questions. We did have questions that we did.
Member for Meadow Lake, please come to order. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
However, the fact of the matter is there's a very good case for taking this forward when it comes to equalization, taking it to the courts, and at the very least we get an answer that was binding at the end, instead of just floating it to the public where we already know what the public thinks and something we all agree on. We need a better deal. Let's push it through the courts. Let's take what's available to us, Mr. Speaker. My question is, why is this government not willing to do so? Are they afraid it'll cause trouble for their federal Conservative cousins, and that's why they backed away in the past? And is that why they're afraid to go forward now?
Recognize the Minister of Trade.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I don't think there's anybody in this province that doubts the willingness and ability of this government to stand up for the interests of this province. We do this every day, Mr. Speaker, but I'll tell you what I've noticed, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not sure if you have, but every opportunity that the Leader of the Opposition gets, he stands with Justin Trudeau. He defends Justin Trudeau. He supports Justin Trudeau's carbon tax. I find it interesting, his statement in his preamble, because his own words, Mr. Speaker, belie what he just said. He said that he supports Justin Trudeau's carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. In fact, he said that we should consider a modest carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. In addition to that, he supports Justin Trudeau on pipelines and opposition to pipelines. He opposed Northern Gateway, Mr. Speaker. He opposes Energy East, Mr. Speaker. He doesn't support building pipelines across this country. He's repeatedly stated that. He stood in front of signs, Mr. Speaker, saying, keep it in the ground. We know that's his position. He can stand with Justin Trudeau.
Next question. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, that member would like to invent quotes that do not belong to me and do not conform with my position. He'd like to do that. But there are quotes that are right in front of us, right available, quotes from Hansard in Ottawa. When that member said that he was going to fight for a better deal if elected. When he said he was going to do so, we had Andrew Scheer say he was going to do so. We had Brad Wall say he was going to do so. But then suddenly, Stephen Harper got elected, and that was going to cause some trouble for him in Ontario and Quebec. So let's leave the equalization thing alone. Let's leave $800 million on the table. We don't need to stand up for Saskatchewan all of a sudden because we've got Conservatives in Ottawa. Let's get a decision today. Will this government take this to court now, so we know that we'll actually proceed with this and not wait to see who's elected this fall?
Recognize the Minister of Trade.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we put forward a proposal on equalization that would see a fair deal. We put that to the federal government, Mr. Speaker. We believe that that would be an appropriate position. We also know what their position is on other court actions, Mr. Speaker. When we challenged the carbon tax in court, something supported by nearly 90% of the public in this province, what did he say, Mr. Speaker? He said it is a pointless crusade. That is his position. He doesn't stand with the people of this province on the carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. He doesn't stand with the people of this province on pipelines, Mr. Speaker. In fact, when we had hard-working, everyday Saskatchewan residents go to, in the thousands, go to a rally to support the energy sector, what did he call them, Mr. Speaker? He said they were anti-Semitic, said they were anti-Islamic, said they were racist, Mr. Speaker. We stand with the people of this province. He can stand with Justin Trudeau all he wants.
Recognize Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Children's Advocate of Saskatchewan released his 2018 report. The number of children in foster care in this province remains among the highest in the country, as does the number of children who've died or been injured while in care. In a week where the Minister of Social Services had to take pains to explain why he didn't want First Nations leaders at the table on discussions about the care of First Nations children, the report highlights a different idea, and it says, and I quote, the necessity to give First Nations full authority over child welfare matters pertaining to First Nations children and youth. Of the children who lost their lives in the last year, 80% of those were First Nations or Métis, and a full 98% of those who were critically injured were of Indigenous descent, Mr. Speaker. The Children's Advocate is calling for the transformation of our child welfare system that was promised back in 2010, Mr. Speaker. When will we finally see the meaningful changes to our child welfare system that Saskatchewan children so desperately need and deserve?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. I recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And any child that's lost in Saskatchewan is a loss for all of us, Mr. Speaker. We take that issue very seriously, especially as Minister of Social Services. Mr. Speaker, as I said yesterday, for the record, I have the utmost respect for the Indigenous culture, history, and the elected representatives at all levels, at the local level, at the provincial level, and at the federal level, Mr. Speaker. As I stated again yesterday, I was wrong to have used the word lobbyist in my interview, and Mr. Speaker, but we were also very glad, and I said this yesterday, and I will continue to say it, we were very glad to have the national Indigenous organizations in the room, Mr. Speaker, to be able to discuss this, Mr. Speaker. We had a great discussion with two of the national Indigenous organizations to make sure that we heard their perspective, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to have those discussions with the First Nations at all levels on the implementation of Bill C-92. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question was, of course, on the Children's Advocate report and the promise back in 2010 that the Children's Advocate points out has never been completed, the promise of a full review of our broken child welfare system. When will that review take place?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I was remiss in my first question to thank the Children's Advocate for all the work that he's done. Mr. Speaker, the Children's Advocate has been traveling to First Nations and communities across this province to be able to re-engage the First Nations and Indigenous communities to build back that relationship with the Children's Advocate Office, Mr. Speaker. As to his report, Mr. Speaker, we are continuing to work on process improvements. This is exactly what we did, Mr. Speaker, with when we did our first contact panel with Saskatoon Tribal Council, as well as our partnership agreement and the delegation, Mr. Speaker. This is exactly what we're trying to do, is engage Indigenous organizations and continue to enhance the other 17 Indigenous organizations to be able to perform the services on behalf of the Government of Saskatchewan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, since 2010, thousands of kids have aged out of childcare, aged out without ever getting any of the support they needed. We've had thousands of kids taken from families, brought into childcare or into foster care without any of the supports they need, without any of that review. Too many kids have been waiting too long. In particular, access to mental health supports and care for children struggling with mental health issues, with addictions, Mr. Speaker, and climbing rates of suicide in northern Saskatchewan, with many children having no access to support whatsoever. In the Advocate's words said, there's no time to wait. But the fact of the matter is, kids have been waiting too long. Hundreds of kids are waiting now for appointments for mental health supports. This lack of support has serious consequences. More kids are struggling with depression, with anxiety. More kids are taking their lives, Mr. Speaker. We've asked for a review of the child welfare system, and we've asked for the development of a suicide prevention strategy to help those kids most in need and most in danger. When will we see that review, and when will we see a suicide prevention strategy for Saskatchewan?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In reference to that, absolutely. Any time we lose a child, as I referenced in my first answer, is a tragedy, Mr. Speaker. And I know the Minister of Rural and Remote Health has worked diligently on this with local communities, Mr. Speaker, but we want to make sure that we look at this from both sides. We want to make sure that we look at it from the children's side to be able to provide the best possible supports that we can for that child in that circumstances, Mr. Speaker, but we also want to look at the parenting side of things. We want to make sure that we have a positive parenting program, Mr. Speaker, and our Keeping Families Together program. This is helping the overall issue, Mr. Speaker, not just in rural Saskatchewan and remote Saskatchewan, but certainly within our urban centres, Mr. Speaker. We want to keep engaging Indigenous organizations around the province, especially up north, to make sure that what the programs that we have are suiting their needs so we can make sure that they have a healthy community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
The Minister of Social Services dismissing elected First Nations leaders as lobbyists
betrayed a lack of understanding and a lack of seriousness when it comes to getting reconciliation right in our province. From mishandling the 60-scoop apology, to failing to consult on their trespass legislation and dragging their feet on child welfare, this government gets it wrong again and again. Now the Ministry of Education's online survey unveiled last month invites any non-student to rank the importance of the following statement from very important to not important at all. Quote, students should have the opportunity to learn about and from Indigenous people. Indigenous cultures, languages, and histories are an important part of learning in schools. Can the minister please explain the intent behind this question? Why is this government reopening the question of whether Indigenous content in classrooms is important? Mr. Speaker, is this really up for debate?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we're very proud of the fact that it was this government, Mr. Speaker, that introduced treaty education into our classrooms, Mr. Speaker, across the province. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, and we're very proud of that, Mr. Speaker, and we know that there's a number of other provinces that have followed our lead with respect to that. Mr. Speaker, just last week, we announced Indigenous language education, Mr. Speaker, that we were going to extend.
Member for Cumberland, please come to order. Recognize Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just last week we announced rolling out of Indigenous language education across the province based on some locally developed courses, Mr. Speaker. So to suggest, Mr. Speaker, that this government or this ministry isn't interested in ensuring First Nations education, First Nations content within our curriculum, Mr. Speaker, is really quite laughable, Mr. Speaker. We've seen an increase Mr. Speaker, we've seen an increase in graduation rates among First Nations, Mr. Speaker. We're very proud of that, Mr. Speaker. But most importantly, Mr. Speaker, we're very proud of the support that this government has given to First Nations culture within our curriculum, Mr. Speaker, and we intend on continuing that great work that we've been doing, Mr. Speaker. The online surveys, Mr. Speaker, we'll take that information under advisement, Mr. Speaker, but this government has no desire, Mr. Speaker, to back away from the commitments we've made to First Nations culture in our classrooms.
Hear, hear. There's a member for John Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, then it begs the question, why is it in the survey in the first place?
Right.
It wasn't that long ago that the previous education minister faced widespread calls for her resignation after she complained in a truly remarkable speech in this legislature of, quote, too much wholesale infusion of Indigenous content into the curriculum. Clearly, the minister hadn't done her homework and was shuffled out of that role, but not before having to apologize and affirm the importance of treaty education in Saskatchewan schools. Mr. Speaker, we thought this matter was settled, but now that very question that led to the call for that former minister's removal is being put to the general public in an online survey. So let's put the question to the minister himself to state where he stands. Should students have the opportunity to learn about and from Indigenous people and our Indigenous cultures, languages, and histories an important part of learning in our schools?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Deputy Premier.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and this government's commitment on this front has been very, very clear, Mr. Speaker. The questions which are in that online survey, Mr. Speaker, were based on consultations with various organizations, Mr. Speaker, including the Treaty Commissioner, Mr. Speaker. So these questions, Mr. Speaker, in consultation with a number of partners within the sector, Mr. Speaker, is the basis of the questions. But I can be unequivocal, Mr. Speaker, in terms of this government's support of treaty education in the classroom, Mr. Speaker, of engaging with respect to First Nations to make sure First Nations culture is understood and taught in the classrooms, Mr. Speaker, and the evidence of that. If the member needs any evidence, Mr. Speaker, she only has to look back to the announcement we made last week, Mr. Speaker, with the offering of First Nations language education in our classrooms, grades 10, grade 11, and grade 12. Mr. Speaker, we're very proud of that.
Hear, hear, hear. As a member for John Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, I have two questions. Who specifically asked for this to be included in the survey? And if it's not up for debate, why are you asking whether or not treaty education and curriculum in our schools is important or not very important at all?
Recognize the Deputy Premier.
As I mentioned before, the questions were developed, all the questions in the questionnaire, Mr. Speaker, were developed with consultation, Mr. Speaker. I wish the member opposite would stop fear-mongering, Mr. Speaker, with the Saskatchewan public. The commitment to treaty education in our classrooms, Mr. Speaker, is painfully clear, Mr. Speaker. She should understand that. And again, Mr. Speaker, if there is any question about this government's commitment with respect to treaty education, Mr. Speaker, or First Language, First Nations culture in our classrooms, she only has to reread the press release that we issued last week with respect to Indigenous language education in our classrooms, Mr. Speaker. I can state unequivocally for the record that this government has absolutely no intention of backing away from those commitments, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, as we go forward with our consultation and our conversations, Mr. Speaker, with people in the education sector, it's our intent to continue to enhance that.
Hear, hear.
The member for John Lake.
Mr. Speaker, the minister will forgive me if I bypass the news releases in favour of actual action. So the question remains, is it up for debate whether or not we have treaty education and curriculum in our classrooms?
Recognize the Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure how many times I have to answer this, Mr. Speaker. It's not up for debate, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the questions in the survey, like every question in the survey, it was created in consultation, Mr. Speaker, with the Treaty Commissioner, Mr. Speaker, who endorsed the question to be in the survey, Mr. Speaker. So if she has a question about why it's in there, maybe she should call the Treaty Commissioner, Mr. Speaker, and ask her that. But the commitment to this government, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to treaty education, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to first language culture in our classroom is clear, Mr. Speaker. It's unequivocal, Mr. Speaker, and we stand by it.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, Peter and Barbara on a freight truck have been abandoned by the Sask Party government as they face another year of illegal flooding of their farm. The WSA is dragging their heels on enforcing the law. And now, the Smith Creek Watershed Association appointed board is threatening to expropriate their land. And to add insult to injury, Smith Creek is now refusing to release any financial documents. We've heard this story before, Mr. Speaker. Last fall, the Privacy Commissioner released a report on the Quill Lakes Watershed Association, and he said to the Minister of Justice, and I'll quote, the minister should, quote, consider amending the legislation to include watershed associations, including the QLWA, as a local authority pursuant to the LA FOIP, end quote. That was 6 months ago, Mr. Speaker. This is to the Minister of Justice, Mr. Speaker. My question is this. Has he considered the Privacy Commissioner's recommendations, and will he make these changes, and if not, why not?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, I take notice of the question.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 149, the Police Regional Policing Amendment Act 2018 without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister.
I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill be now read for the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration Committee of the Whole on Bill number 149 and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading. I recognize the Minister.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 149 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? It's a pleasure, Assembly, to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 150, the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2018 without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister.
Leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 150 and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? Minister may proceed to move third reading.
Move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 150 be now read a third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? On division.
Third reading of this bill.
I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 158, the Youth Justice Administration Act 2018 with amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister of Corrections.
I request leave to waive consideration in the Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill and its amendments be now read the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 158 and that the bill and its amendments be now read a third time. Is leave granted? When shall the amendments be read a first time? Recognize the Minister.
I move that the amendments be now read a first and second time.
It has been moved by the Minister that the amendments be now read a first and second time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First and second reading of the amendments.
The Minister may proceed to move third reading. Recognize the Minister.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 158 be now read a third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 169, the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency Act without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 169 and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? Minister may proceed to move third reading.
I move that the bill now be read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 169 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Orders of the day. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, so the committees may continue their work today. I move this House to now adjourn.
It has been moved by the Government House Leader that this Assembly do now adjourn. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. This Assembly now stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1:30 p.m.